Welcome to part 3 of the vertical vivarium conversion miniseries. If you've spent any amount of time on my channel, you've probably quickly realized that I'm a huge advocate of false bottoms. That being said, I've tried various methods, and the one that I'm about to show you is my personal favorite for various reasons. Remember also that all of the principles that I show you in this series can easily be altered for a tank of any type or size. Let's backtrack a little bit though. Why should you even incorporate a false bottom in your vivarium build? Well, as I've explained in some of my terrarium builds, it serves several key purposes. It acts as a reservoir that holds excess water and keeps said water separate from your substrate. It's also important to have this reservoir present because it will help keep your vivarium humid, which in turn will provide the optimal conditions for your plants and animals. However, you don't want this reservoir to remain in contact with the substrate. The reason being that your substrate will quickly become putrid if it remains in constant contact with the water. If the substrate becomes putrid, it must be replaced, or this environment will quickly harm your plants and eventually your animals. Another consideration is that unlike a terrarium, you will be watering your vivarium at least once a day. Inevitably, this false bottom will quickly fill up with water and will come in contact with the substrate. That's why I will show you how to make a drainable false bottom. As always, there are several ways that you could go about doing this, but I will show you what I think is the easiest and cost-effective way to create such a false bottom. And no, you will not have to siphon water out with an airline tube. Before I show you about the false bottom though, I want to briefly address something from the previous video. Many of you were concerned with excess water building up in the planters on the background. This has never caused me any issues before, so I didn't address it in the previous video. Regardless, to deal with this problem as simply as possible, just drill a hole in the bottom of the planters through the foam. The foam will close up after you drill, but water can still drain through the hole pretty effectively. There are other ways that you could solve this of course, but this is the easiest method that I could come up with after the background was already created. Now, to begin with the false bottom, let's get a piece of egg crate. You can get a 24 by 48 inch piece of this for around $10 at your local hardware store, but I'm using scrap pieces from a previous build. I find that wire cutters are very effective at easily cutting the crate. You should also wear glasses when cutting because it's likely that pieces will be flying everywhere. Let's start out by cutting a piece of egg crate slightly smaller than the bottom of our vivarium. Use a marker to indicate where the crate will be cut. Then cut your crate to size using these marks like so. Since my piece was slightly smaller, I attached another piece on the other side using zip ties to create a larger piece. As long as your final piece of egg crate is smaller than your vivarium, it will work. Since this will be a drainable false bottom, it can be pretty low profile. By this I mean that it doesn't need to be very tall. That being said, cut out 4 smaller pieces similar to what you see here. After cutting all of the pieces out, attach them to the underside of the largest piece using some zip ties. Then go around and snip off the excess pieces from the zip ties. Now, double check to make sure that your new egg crate false bottom fits into your vivarium. With any luck, it should fit just fine. Next, you're going to need some mesh. Typically I use fiberglass window screen, which is only $8 per roll. Again, I'm using leftovers from a previous project. Measure the bottom of your vivarium and remember the dimensions. If you will be making several vivariums like myself, it might be a good idea to make a cardboard guide like this. Then cut out this piece of mesh using scissors or an X-Acto knife. I suggest using something like an X-Acto knife as you can be more precise with your cuts. Now we are going to cut 4 smaller pieces of mesh. Basically you want these pieces to be taller than the sides of your false bottom. Mine are about an inch taller as you can see by this roller. You will also see that they are about 3 inches longer than the egg crate on either side. After determining a good size, cut out the mesh. I found that it was easier not to use the cardboard guide in this instance since these pieces are just strips. Now we are going to attach the mesh to the false bottom using some zip ties. This works best with thin zip ties because they can fit through the holes of the mesh without ripping it. Also, you really only need 4 to 6 zip ties per piece of mesh. Place an even amount on the top and bottoms like so. The placement of the mesh is also very important. Make sure that the mesh only hangs off on the underside of the egg crate. After you have one piece of mesh secured, put another piece on the opposite side using the same procedure as before. Now fold over the excess mesh and zip tie it in place. After doing so, attach the other two pieces of the mesh like before. Now that all the mesh is attached, we will prepare for use. Get a pair of scissors and cut the corner of the mesh that is hanging over. The reason that we did this was so that the mesh will fold outward as seen here. You will likely have to cut off some excess mesh like this. After doing so, your false bottom should fit in place as such. Now for the drainage element, we're going to need three things: an airline tube flow valve, some airline tubing, and a 1/4 inch uni seal. I got a 10 pack of uni seals on Amazon for $16.19, which equates to $1.62 per uni seal, which is pretty cheap since I will be using these on future projects. Initially I tried doing this without the uni seal to keep it cheaper for myself and you guys, but this really will not be effective unless you use one. Although the uni seal is designed for a 1/4 inch tube, they require a 1/2 inch hole. Since I don't have a hole saw, I had to gradually work my way up to a 1/2 inch bit. Otherwise, the acrylic sheet would have cracked. After getting your hole drilled, you can press the uni seal into place. Now get some airline tube and attach it to the end of your flow valve. This will create a tighter fit with the uni seal. Snip off the excess tube once you have it fully attached. Then, firmly press the flow valve into the uni seal. This is a good method for drainage because you can still remove the drain at any time. This gadget is designed specifically to create a waterproof seal, so you shouldn't have any issues. Regardless, it's still good to do a water test. Just make sure that your flow valve is screwed shut and fill it up. Once you've determined that your vivarium is watertight, test out your new drain. I attached an airline tube onto the flow valve so that I can direct the draining water. As you can see, this doesn't drain all of the water, and it shouldn't. As I explained earlier, this reservoir of water will help keep your vivarium humid. If for whatever reason you need to drain your vivarium completely, you have options. You can either tip the vivarium slightly, or simply remove the uni seal. Now that our drainage mechanism is in place, we can finish the false bottom. Begin by drying out your vivarium and if necessary, remove any excess debris. Now cut a piece of paper or cardboard to the exact size of your false bottom like so. Next, place your egg crate false bottom into the vivarium. Make sure that the mesh is curled out like this. Now place your paper or cardboard on top of the egg crate. This will prevent gravel from falling into the holes. Now gradually pour gravel into your vivarium and push it into the gap between the glass and the egg crate. Remember how the mesh was curled out? Well, the gravel will sit on this so that the crate remains in place. Also, I'm using natural colored stones as I prefer this type of aesthetic. You can use whatever color you want though. After you get the gravel evenly dispersed, you can remove the paper. If you get some gravel down in the cracks, it's no big deal. Now, place the mesh on top of the egg crate and gravel. This will keep your substrate out of the false bottom, but allow the water to drain all the way through. You're also probably wondering why we didn't attach this piece to the egg crate. I didn't do this because it's much easier to get the mesh properly placed if it's not attached to the rest of the false bottom. Finally, I like to throw a little bit of gravel on top of the mesh just to ensure that it stays in place for when we're adding our substrate. That about sums it up. Once again, I will show you how it works, but now with the false bottom completely constructed. Now you know how to make a very efficient, cost-effective, and aesthetically pleasing false bottom. In my opinion, this works and looks better than most other methods.